Hello everyone, my name is Allegra Integra, and today I am going to do my February wrap-up. By the way, I know my lighting is terrible, and I'm still working on the sound. I'm hoping that my tax refund can help me fund a microphone and maybe a little camera, but we'll see what happens. I'm working with what I got here, and I do work a full-time job, so today I'm recording with a light in my face. But to get right into the actual book content, this last month, I read 8 books, which I was pretty happy about. So let's just get right to what I actually read. The first book that I read, I actually listened to. I like to have an audiobook going when I'm doing my chores, that kind of stuff. And I listened to The Poet X, which is by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a YA contemporary story that is set completely in verse, and that's actually why I chose to listen to this as opposed to read it, because it is actually written kind of like a long slam poem. It is about a young woman who is Dominican, and she is trying to learn to balance as a young American first generation young woman, and kind of balancing the culture of her family, her mother's religion in particular, and her own experiences with religion while she's just growing up as a teenager in New York. And it's kind of based around her writing poems in a book that her twin brother has given her. The main character, Xiomara, is just struggling with fitting in. I really enjoyed this book. I did end up giving it 4 stars. Hearing it spoken in verse by the author was fantastic. It was probably one of the better YA stories that I've read in a while. I'm not the largest fan of YA, but I like it, especially when I'm trying to get through something kind of fast. And since this was written entirely in verse, and this is the first time I've read a contemporary story in verse, it was a really awesome experience. I gave this book 4 stars. It kind of falls off at the end for me. I feel like it got wrapped up a little bit too easily, but I think that this is just a fantastic story. It's a wonderful coming of age conversation while also integrating the character's discovery and love of slam poetry in a really interesting way. If I were a teenager or were recommending books to teenagers, this would be on the top of my list. The next book that I read in February was 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl by Mona Awad. I was so disappointed in this book. I probably would have given this 1 star if Mona Awad's writing wasn't so clearly just beautiful and smooth. I guess that's the best way I can think to put it today. I loved Bunny by this author. I thought it was fantastic. She has another book coming out that I'm really looking forward to. I don't know if it's because I don't think it's because it was a bunch of little vignettes, because that is actually a really interesting approach to storytelling that I liked in this case. That's another reason I ended up actually giving it 2 stars, but I almost gave it 1. I don't know if it's because it's a debut novel, if it just wasn't that interesting, or if, as someone who's always been a straight-sized woman, this book just wasn't for me. I have no problem with a character struggling and showing characters struggle with their marginalization, with the things that they've gone through. But this book didn't feel like there was anything to celebrate about this person's identity. About her name changes like 6 times in the book, but it's the same character, which was actually interesting because it's talking about identity. But it's possible I just didn't get it. But it felt very self-loathing without any kind of, I don't want to say lesson, because my books don't all need to have a lesson, but I think it would have been better had there been some kind of conversation outside of, this person is fat and she hates that she's fat, and that it runs her whole life. I get that if you are a larger person, that is a huge part of your interaction with the world. So that's why I don't know that I can say other people would have the same experience, but this really fell flat for me. There was so much self-loathing without any exploration like a larger exploration as to why that would exist in this character's life, that it didn't do it for me. And I'm really sad because I loved Bunny. This was Mona Awad's first book, so maybe she's hit her stride with Bunny, and I'm still going to give All's Well a chance. I just hope that it leans more like Bunny and less like this group of vignettes. The next book that I finished in February was We Are Never Meeting in Real Life by Samantha Irby, which is another collection, although this is a nonfiction book. It's a collection of stories about Samantha Irby's life. She's a blogger, and this definitely read like blog posts. I ended up giving it 3 stars because they read like blog posts. So reading it in a book setting I didn't mind it. I just didn't find it particularly life-changing or feel like the writing style itself grabbed me in any particular way. I have a feeling 6 months from now, if you ask me about the book, I'm not going to be able to remember a whole lot about the individual stories. I think that Samantha Irby is a wonderful writer. She has a really engaging voice. She clearly is Samantha Irby in what she's writing about. And I guess that makes sense because it's her own life experiences. But regardless, she does have a very strong voice and a very consistent voice throughout. And while it did feel like separate blog posts that were a little bit disconnected, there was obviously connections. For example, there were many references to her cat, Helen Keller, which is explained in the books and the essays. But it's also, I don't know, it's a sense of humor that didn't work completely for me. And I like memoirs for the most part, but I'm getting a little bit frustrated with memoirs that are marketed as being really funny when they're actually extremely sad. I don't mind dark books. I don't mind dark nonfiction. I sometimes want to read those things. I am very much a person who thinks that shining light on the dark parts of our lives is an important part of being an artist and being a human. But when something is marketed as humor and it's much more sad than humorous, I get a little bit frustrated. I've used that word a lot today. It just doesn't do it for me. When I want to read something funny, I want to read something funny. If I want to read something darkly funny, then I'll seek out something darkly funny. If I want to read something sad or dark, then I'm going to reach out to that. There was a bit of a marketing issue, I think, with this particular book, but it was fine. I enjoyed it. I don't feel the same way I felt about 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl with this, which was almost a waste of time. This wasn't a waste of time, and I think that I could possibly give her other books a chance, but I have so many other books that I'm waiting to read that they're going to be kind of pushed back a little bit. But, for example, she had some really wonderfully darkly funny conversations in the book about, the death of her father, which handling death with humor is really important. But there were other stories about her childhood where she when she talked about her experiences in a funny way, it almost felt a little too forced, as if she wasn't able to be completely genuine in having that conversation. And that could just be because her voice is so consistent and it didn't quite gel with me. But if someone is really into that really dark, humorous take that's also self-deprecating, I think this would be a good book for them. It just wasn't for me. And the next book that I completed in February is going to make everyone think that I had a bad reading month. And it wasn't my best reading month. But I read Homebody by Rupee. I have read her other 2 poetry collections, so Milk and Honey and The Sun and Her Flowers. And I read those in, I believe it was 2017. I got both of them and read them and just felt gutted. I needed to hear what she was writing about at the time, and because I was going through a lot in my personal life that summer, I felt like a lot of the topics that she was touching on just hit straight to my soul. And I don't have them with me right now, but I have those physical copies of those books, and they're just dog-eared, just through different poems that really resonated with me. And they probably still would today. I have no regrets about reading those. Homebody, however, felt like more of the same. I have changed a lot since I read The Sun and Her Flowers and Milk and Honey that summer. And I don't feel like her poetry changed along with me, which sounds, that's so selfish because like she's going to grow in her own way and I'm going to grow in my own way. Authors are their own people and they get to grow the way that makes sense to them. But I didn't feel like there was anything new in this poetry collection. I also am starting to find myself moving away from micro poetry or like the Instagram poetry style that she's famous for. The poems just felt like they were the same again. It was like reading the same book. I didn't feel like there was a ton of distinction. It didn't feel different from the other two. And I'm at a point in my life where I want something different. I don't want a repeat of what she's already done. And I'm trying to get more into long form poetry again. I haven't had the best luck with my attempts at poetry this year, which is breaking my heart a little bit. So if anyone has poetry suggestions, I would love that. But yeah, I gave Homebody 2 stars. And I think Rupee Kaur and I have had our moment, and now it's time for both of us to go our own way. Okay, so then I read Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. And this was a 5-star read. So I finally got some good 5-star reads in this year that are fiction. This is actually a novella that is set 7 years after the release of Birth of a Nation. So this is an alternate history where the Klan, so the KKK, actually has some supernatural elements to it as well. And it follows a character who has been trying to manage that supernatural element because of her own connection with different spirits, specifically, I believe, from Gullah Geechee spirits. I am not fully well versed in that, so please don't quote me on that. There is Gullah in the book, and I think it was a really important, well, it absolutely was a really important plot point. But as someone who only knows a little bit about it, I just found that fascinating, and I thought it was a great take on a historical situation. So I guess plot-wise, what happens is these characters have been fighting Ku Kluxes, which are monsters within the Klan. There are also just regular hateful people in the Klan. And they know that a rescreening of the movie Birth of the Nation is going to happen, and that something is going to happen because of that, because it acts like a spell. And our main character, Maurice, is fighting them and kind of gets caught up in her own experience with different parts of the spiritual world. And there's a lot of references to the Briar Rabbit stories. It is not spelled Briar Rabbit, but since that's not my dialect, I'm not going to pronounce it that way. Bruh Rabbit, but that doesn't sound right. So Briar Rabbit, Briar Fox. Incorporating those mythologies into history, I think, was brilliant. When I first went into this story, I was a little bit apprehensive about having this discussion about like the Klan and racism in the United States while also putting that supernatural element to it, because I think that there's plenty to be horrified by without adding like actual literal monsters to the story. However, I think allegorically this actually really worked, and while I already have a really visceral reaction to stories about the KKK, incorporating Gullah mythology and spirituality and like Ring Shout, the book is called Ring Shout, but Ring Shout kind of call and response conversations into the story was something I hadn't seen before, and I want to see more of in these stories. It was done really artfully, and it was done in a way that makes you think about things without just like hitting you over the head, despite it being a short story or a novella. And sometimes my problem with novellas is I want more, or I feel like their like moral is a little bit too heavy-handed. I did not feel that way with this book at all. It was fantastic, and I think everyone needs to read it. It's short. It doesn't take very long. It is terrifying. The body horror is just, ugh, but I love that stuff. So yeah, this was probably one of my favorites so far, and very well could be one of my favorites of the year. So many books this month. All right, so next I read White Ivy, and that is by Susie Yang. I I went into this really excited because it was going to be a contemporary conversation about like the immigrant experience. And while there was a lot in it, so you follow a young woman named Ivy, who is the daughter of immigrants from China. They came from China to the Boston area, and she actually stayed in China. She was born there until she was about 5, and then she comes when her parents can afford to bring her over. And she never really fits in. She's kind of struggling with that first generation identity crisis that I don't have a personal experience of, but I've heard of, where you're trying to like balance again that traditional family, like your family's traditions and your family's heritage with being a young person in the United States and wanting to fit in there and juggling those two identities. And unlike in the Poet X, Ivy actually doesn't have that like neat fix. So she actually gets in trouble when she's around 13 or 14, and her parents send her back to China because they feel that if she goes to China for the summer that she'll learn like how lucky she is to be in the United States. And while she's in China, her family actually moves to New Jersey, and she comes back, and then it kind of time skips through high school and hits her post-college years, where she reconnects with a boy that she liked in junior high before she left for China, and ends up dating him. He's the son of a very powerful like WASP family in the Boston area, and it just kind of follows her trying to balance all of those things while also being in love with someone else who is also the child of an immigrant who is Romanian. It was good. It was fine. I feel like some of the twists were really obvious, and then the final twist, it kind of felt like the last couple chapters were a different book. Which, like right away, I thought, oh yeah, this is 4 stars. It was pretty good. I loved the ending. I know some people didn't like the ending. I like open endings, but I do feel like there was a push either in editing or something with this book to make it more shocking, and the book really suffered for that. I wanted more of the character conversations, and maybe there's a reason that it's got a love triangle aspect to it, which was getting interesting, and then it's kind of switches into a different book, and I didn't love that. Neither of the love interests really had much of a personality, and I don't know if that was intentional on the author's part, because Ivy is actually very self-centered and ambitious and is not written as like a triumph so much as a tragedy of a character, which is an interesting take on this story, and I think that's great. But I wanted more depth to the other characters to make me care more about the book. Again, not a waste of time. I really did enjoy the reading of it. It went pretty fast, but it seemed a little bit disjointed, especially at the end, so I gave this 3 stars. Then I read The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and I don't think I need to explain this book much, but it is a wrap-up, so I will anyway. This is the story of a woman who no longer wants to live and makes an attempt on her life and wakes up in a library in the middle, kind of like in between life and death. And while she's in the library, she has the option to kind of try on other lives that she could have had if she had made different decisions in her life. And she wakes up, or she enters that life at midnight on that day. Sometimes she's asleep at that time, so then she'll wake up later, and then she gets to live parts of that life. And if she chooses, or if there's too many regrets and she doesn't want that life, she comes back to the library and has the option to choose something else. If she finds the perfect life, then maybe she'll keep living that life and she'll just slowly be part of it. That's kind of the premise. I went into this really wary because it seems a little bit of a cheesy concept, and anytime we're talking about mental health and regrets and wanting to take your own life, you can get into really touchy topics, and it can either go like really dark and poorly done, or it can become super, super cheesy. Despite the premise of this story, it is actually really hopeful. There are a lot of sad things that happen in the book, but overall it has a hopeful vibe, and I actually really appreciated that. it didn't brush away the actual real concerns of someone with depression. Because it has a little bit of a like It's a Wonderful Life feel. There's a bit of cheesiness in it, but after reading a lot of these heavier books, it was absolutely what I needed. And I do think that it's treated with respect. I ended up giving this 5 stars. If I wanted to get really like picky, it'd probably be like 4.5, 4.75. But overall, it's a 5-star. I would totally read this book again. I actually got it from the library, and I plan on purchasing it for my bookshelf, which isn't something I do super often, but that's part of why I do the library thing, so I can choose what I want to purchase. It was just really good, and I really liked the overall message, and the writing was really engaging. The reason it wasn't like a pure 5 stars, like absolutely this is 5 stars, is there are a couple of things that I wish the author had explored more with another character that she meets in one of her lives who kind of touches on like the physics of how this might happen. I don't want to get spoilery, but yeah, that just would have been cool, but maybe it would have bogged the book down or made it get a little bit too cheesy. I really loved this story. I am always wary when we talk about mental health and things like suicidal ideation, but I think it was handled super, super respectfully, with the concept of like triggers in mind, and I really liked how things resolved in this story too. So yeah, 5 stars. Probably gonna buy a copy to keep on my shelf. And last this month, I read Horrid by Katrina Leno. This is a YA horror fantasy novel. No, it's not a fantasy. It's YA horror. And I don't know. It was a fast read and it was a fun read. A couple things I really enjoyed about this story was something I noticed specifically is the author made it clear to kind of explain Agatha Christie's books. The main character loves Agatha Christie books. And instead of assuming that everyone knows Agatha Christie information like who Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple are, she has in the dialogue that like a bit of an explanation, which I think is really cool because you'll actually get a lot of books. You'll hear a lot of criticism about books written by people of color specifically, where they mention things like, for example, in The Poet X, when she's talking about Dominican things, white readers will often be like, well, that needs to be explained. I don't understand that. But you won't necessarily see that in books written by white authors. And I just kind of liked that there was that explanation, even though, because some people might make an assumption that if you're reading this level of book that you know who Agatha Christie is, but maybe you don't. Maybe you're reading this and it's translated and you don't know who those people are. I really liked those kind of details, and that is kind of included throughout the book, which was cool. It was a fast read. It wasn't super creepy to me. But again, since it's a YA horror, I think that probably lessened some of the horror elements on it. And I like to get deep into that body horror and deep into that creeping existential horror. As far as like an introduction to horror, I think this would be a great option. The writing is really straightforward, and I enjoyed what happened in the book. But overall, I did give it a 3-star because for me, the simplicity of it didn't grab me the way that I wanted it to. And the story itself, I don't mind if I can predict the twists. I think that means that the author is putting enough information down for you to actually figure out what's happening. But I just hit like every story beat. I knew where it was going completely. The ending was pretty cool. I thought that was probably actually the creepiest part. But overall, it just wasn't my favorite because it was a little bit too straightforward, a little bit too simplistic. I think that my biggest issue with YA isn't that it isn't complex or isn't that it isn't good storytelling, because it can be and it absolutely is. It's that I am not as interested in teenager stories, whether it is a teenager going through something that's horror focused, whether it's a coming of age for a teenager, or whether it is even to a point like fantasy. It really has to sell me if it's about like a teenager or actual young adult. And not that there's anything wrong with those stories, it's just not currently grabbing me. So this did end up being a 3-star because I wasn't super blown away by it. That cover is gorgeous, and I do think if you are trying to like ease your way into horror, this would be a wonderful introduction. And that is what I read in February. I hopefully will be keeping up this pace, if not even more, in March, because I have a ton of books I still need to get to for my last library haul, and you'll probably see another haul here soon, because I'm always getting books from my library. But thank you so much, and I will see you all later. Bye!